Let me start with the Citizenship Amendment Bill, 7+ minute speech in the Rajya Sabha on the CAB, that is a Citizenship Amendment Bill 2019, and I found it to be the most succinct and neat challenge to the constitutionality of the legislation that I've heard or read. Since many in the audience may not have been through that yet, may I request you to give us a brief idea of why you have concluded that this is unconstitutional and whether there's any update on the matter. We note that mass protests have occurred in several states. Some parts of India are burning, and repression seems to have been unleashed on the protesters.
Okay. Now, the bill is what in law we call a suspect bill. I mean, nobody at this stage can say with complete certitude it is unconstitutional. We call it suspect bill. It is suspect because the classification is suspect. Article 14 of the Constitution has three aspects. One is the well-known one, that there has to be reasonable classification, otherwise it violates the rule of equality. The second is the classification must have a nexus to the object sought to be achieved. You can always classify, but the classification must have a nexus to the object sought to be achieved. And the third dimension, which the Supreme Court has introduced in the last decade or so, is that it cannot be arbitrary. It has to conform to principles of constitutional morality, universal rights, basic human rights. These are the unwritten laws of a civilized society.
Judge-made law?
Judge-made law included. Now, this bill is clearly suspect. What does it do? It picks three countries, neighbors, leaves out the others. It picks 6 communities, calling them minority communities, leaves out the others. And then says, if you belong to one of the 6 communities, and if you come from one of the 3 countries, I will, in my executive discretion, declare you are not an illegal migrant. Once you are not an illegal migrant, you are entitled to become a citizen of India. Now look at the absurdity of this permutation and combination, 3 and 6. Hindus are included, but Sri Lankan Hindus are excluded. Why? Christians are included, but Bhutanese Christians are excluded. Why? There was an earlier cutoff date, June 1948. The Assam Accord had another cutoff date, 25th March 1971. Now even new cutoff date, 31st December 2014. Now in Assam alone, 19 lakh people have been identified as illegal migrants because they came with a story which was rejected. The story was, I was born here. Or the story was, my father was born here and I'm his descendant. The story was, my grandfather was born here and I'm his descendant. I don't have papers. Now today, this man has to tell a different story. He has to tell the story that I belong to one of the 3 countries. I was religiously persecuted in this village or this town. Because of religious persecution, I came into India. Now please declare me not as an illegal migrant. Now obviously, the story he said earlier, which was rejected, and the story he's going to say now, one of them is a lie. Which story is a lie and which story is the truth? There are so many infirmities in the bill that we are pretty certain, many of us are pretty certain, Soli Sorabji, Justice Madan Lokhu, retired, Justice Santosh Hegde, retired, have all felt that this is unconstitutional. The most weighty argument is there is something known as constitutional morality. It has been developed as a doctrine by the Supreme Court. It was developed in the Aadhar case. It was developed in the Puttaswamy case on privacy. It was developed in the Delhi government was as LG, Union Territory of Power, Union Territory of Delhi. The constitutional morality. What is the constitutional morality in effectively, net? Just apply. You apply the CAB first or apply the NRC first. If you apply the NRC first, all of them will be excluded and the non-Muslims will be included through the CAB door. If you apply the CAB first, the CAB will include all the non-Muslims and NRC will keep out only the Muslims. So the net result is only the Muslims will be kept out. This is constitutionally immoral, which is why the United States House Foreign Affairs Committee and the UN Human Rights Commission said, citizenship based on religion is against the basic tenets of a democracy. Citizenship is universally based on the principle of jus soli, J-U-S-S-O-L-I, the principle of territoriality. Anybody found within the territory of a country is a citizen, unless this, of course, is disqualified. Only Israel is based on the principle of religion, maybe one or two other countries. We are based on the principle of territoriality, which we think that this bill is suspect. When I listed these questions, and I was hoping somebody will answer, well, nobody has answered it.
Yes, you listed 6 questions, but you also made another point about the responsibility, or rather the irresponsibility of Parliament in pushing this matter to the lap, as you put it, to the lap of the judges. How serious is that in terms of demeaning Parliament?
This is becoming more and more of a pattern these days. See, you elect us to make laws. We are elected representatives, which means you are making the law, effectively. In a representative democracy, you are making the law. The maker of the law must pause to ask himself, is he making a constitutional law? He can't make any law and then say, I have made the law, I don't care whether it's constitutional or not. Let the unelected judges decide. I have great respect for judges and let them decide. But as an elected representative, the maker of the law, am I not obliged to ask myself, am I satisfied this law is valid? I think elected representatives abdicating completely their responsibility. See, a bill like this cannot go through the British Parliament in less than about 2-3 weeks. You saw what happened to Johnson's Brexit agenda calendar. He could not push it through within even a week. We passed the bill in the cabinet on Sunday evening, introduced in the Lok Sabha on Monday morning, passed on Monday midnight, introduced in Rajya Sabha on Wednesday morning, passed at about 6 o'clock in the evening. A bill of this nature, which completely changes the basis of citizenship after 70 years, the very fundamental basis of citizenship is changed from territoriality to religion. Can it be simply passed by elected representatives without even reflecting whether this is constitutional or not? So I said, what are you doing? You are abdicating your responsibility in favor of judges. I'm a both parliamentarian and lawyer. You don't respect my view as a parliamentarian. I have no option but to go as a lawyer before another forum.
You charged, in fact, that a small part of the Constitution is sought to be wrecked and demolished by this insidious bill.
See, there are provisions in the Constitution for citizenship. That is expanded in the Citizenship Act, sections 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Citizenship by birth, citizenship by descent, citizenship by naturalization, citizenship by registration, and citizenship by acquiring territory. 5 modes of acquiring citizenship is explained in the Act. Now, this Act fleshes out the constitutional provision. Now, what are you doing? The constitutional provision is based on territoriality. It's fleshed out in 5 sections. You are now introducing an insidious principle of religion and wrecking the constitution through the back door. If you had a 2/3 majority, the government would have amended the constitution. Thank God you did not give them a 2/3 majority. If you had given them a 2/3 majority, they won't make this amendment law. They will amend the constitution. But you are wrecking the constitution through the back door.
Yes. Over the years, some parts of the Constitution perhaps have been chipped away, the secular nature of the Constitution. But nothing like this has happened before, has it?
No, I know of no provision of the Constitution which directly introduces the principle of religion as a consideration for something or other. Religion as a consideration for citizenship. Now, tomorrow, if they introduce religion as a consideration for electability, if they introduce religion as a consideration for holding a constitutional office, if they introduce religion as a consideration for anything, and I hope they won't go to the absurdity of saying a consideration for a ration card. How can you introduce religion as a criterion for citizenship or electability or holding a constitutional office?
Now, on the question of divisiveness, Hindutva, challenge to the idea of India, all of which you have raised, either in the Rajya Sabha speech or elsewhere, or here in the opening statement, can they get away with it, do you think?
They seem to be getting away with it, at least in the Hindi-speaking states. You see, the BJP's footprint has actually shrunk. There was a very interesting 2 maps. The BJP ruled states about a year and a half ago, and the BJP ruled states. It has shrunk. It's really in parts of the Hindi-speaking states. If you say Maharashtra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Telangana, leave out Karnataka for the time being, Orissa, Bengal, the BJP is not ruling these states. Even in the Hindi states, it is not ruling Rajasthan, Punjab, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. It's there. But in the parliament election, they swept the Hindi-speaking states. The arithmetic of India's elections is, if you win 7 states, you can rule India. All you have got to win is 7 states in India. If you have an overwhelming majority in 7 states of India, you can rule India. Now, in these states, the Hindu agenda, the Hindu Rashtra agenda, is being pushed aggressively. These are the states where there is a clear, let's say, animosity between Hindu and Muslim communities. That's not so in the south. Not nearly anywhere near like that. There may be some pockets here, but in the North Indian states, there's great animosity between Hindu and Muslim communities. They practically live in compartments in villages, and even in cities, Muslims live apart from the Hindus. They live together, but they also have constant friction. The north and northwestern states are the states affected by the wars of India, which over the years. These are the states which are affected by migration at the time of partition. See, fortunately, West and South India were completely outside migration and outside wars. The 2 calamities never hit us, which is why there's greater tolerance here between Hindu and Muslim communities. Now, taking advantage of the fact that there is latent friction between Hindu and Muslim communities, they are pushing the Hindu agenda, Hindu Rashtra agenda, aggressively in these states. And the fallout you can find in other states, Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura. The fallout is there. They look at how they have used the first 7 months of the second term. This is my distinguished friend Shivaraman here. I mean, anyone passionately concerned about India should list. What should you list? I've got a renewed mandate. What is my first priority? Growth. What is my second priority? Investment. Third, employment. 4, rural wages and rural welfare. Consumption must rise. In the 7 months, look at the agenda they have taken up. I listed it in my opening remark. Look at the agenda. The first was criminalization of triple talaq. Second was Article 370. The third was the now infructuous NRC exercise on Assam. And the fourth was the CAB. Why? Are these the most pressing concerns? You are all middle class, upper middle class. Are these your concerns? I've spent a lot of time with very poor people. Are these their concerns? I meet a lot of people, young people. Are these their concerns? They may be concerned, but they are lower down in the priority, far lower down. Address issues which concern people. Instead of that, they have spent the last 7 months expending a huge amount of political capital and political energy on issues which are far, far removed from the minds of the people. Why? To push the Hindu Rashtra agenda of the RSS.
And this takes us to the area of the economy.
Yes.
I think a lot of people would be interested in hearing you on this.
Arvind Subramaniam was the chief economic advisor until last year. He did not part amicably. He left a disappointed man because they were not willing to listen to him. And what has he said today? The paper, I got it last night. They are all in Nimrana. The paper was published, I think, 2-3 days ago. But why is the media blacking out this paper? It's a trenchant paper by Arvind and John Feldman. With data, graphs, arguments. And what does he come to the conclusion? He says, this is not an ordinary slowdown. We've had slowdowns. 2001, 2002 was a slowdown. Yashwant Sinha was finance minister. 2008 was a great recession, the global financial crisis. I was the finance minister. 2012-13 was a famous taper tantrum. I was the finance minister. We've had slowdowns. But this, he says, is not an ordinary slowdown. This is the great Indian slowdown. And the Indian economy seems headed for the intensive care unit. Can you have stronger language than that from a former chief economic advisor? The minister says, all's well in India. I'm in complete command and control. Maybe because she doesn't eat onions. This is a grave situation.
They say the problems are cyclical, with the implications that they are in the natural order of things. And you said there's a small mercy in your Indian Express column, which you resumed after 160 days in incarceration. You said that it's a small mercy. They haven't said it's seasonal. And therefore...
See, this is the fundamental problem of this government. It lacks talent. I can't comment on the political talent. And I'm not even envious that we are not in government and they are in government. Whatever political talent they can assemble, let the Honorable Prime Minister assemble the political talent. But if you are short on political talent, you have to hire non-political talent. And non-political talent is available in abundance in this country, abundance in this world. Indians, Raghuram Rajan, Abhijit Banerjee, even Arvind Panagriya, Arvind Subramanian. Abundant talent is available. Why don't you hire talent? Let me take you into a secret. Dr. Manmohan Singh, at any given time, said, we must have 6 economists somewhere in the system that you can talk to privately, tap into whenever you like. We always had 6 economists. Many of you may have forgotten the names. Let me remind you, at any given time, in the 10-year period 2004 to 2014, we had a minimum of 6 distinguished economists somewhere in the system. Dr. Rangarajan, Dr. Bimal Jalan, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Govind Rao, somewhere in the system, advisor to finance minister. We created a post just to have Vijay Kelkar there first, and then Subhashish Gangopadhyaya, and chief economic advisor, advisor to prime minister, chairman, council of economic advisors, Dr. Rangarajan, governor Reserve Bank, deputy governor Reserve Bank, deputy chairman planning commission, member planning commission. We always had a minimum of 6 people. Now show me one person in this government who's truly independent, not simply holding a job, truly independent, and will speak to the Prime Minister. And I know that Dr. Singh used to invite 1 or 2 of them for breakfast or lunch and chat with them. And I would pick up the phone and ring up and say, listen, this is what somebody tells me, what is your view? And I remember Dr. Y.V. Reddy, I would say, Venu, you have to come to Delhi this Saturday and spend an hour with me. And he would come. He would just come and spend an hour. That is the kind of talent you have to hire. This fundamental problem of this government is it ignores Tirukkural. Noi nadi, noi mudal nadi, adan vai nadi, vai pachayal. You must find out what is the root of the problem. If you describe the problem as cyclical, you're doomed. This is not a cyclical problem. There are cyclical aspects of the problem, but this is basically a structural problem today.
You have also said that criticize the government for, quote, its stubborn and mulish defense of indefensible decisions taken in the past, which you list as demonetization, a flawed GST, tax terrorism, regulatory overkill, protectionism, and centralization of decision-making in the PMO. And the last point, you also say decisions are taken in the PMO and implemented in the finance ministry.
See, these are 5 major blunders of this government. They persist with it. 10 days ago, finance minister in the House says demonetization was right. Now, the IMF's chief economist, the lady, Indian lady, Geeta Gopinath. What did she say? And I'm quoting her. I have traveled across the world and I have not come across a single economist who has a good word for demonetization. But the finance minister of India says demonetization is right. We did the right thing. Now what do?
Won them votes, it seemed, in Uttar Pradesh.
Yes. How do you defend demonetization? Even after the catastrophic consequences of demonetization, if you continue to defend demonetization, why should I not call it stubborn and mulish? The same thing in the GST. Play back my speech in Parliament. I said, I beg you, GST world over is one rate. You don't believe me? Believe Arvind Subramaniam's report. The revenue neutral rate report where he recommended 14.5 to 15. That was high, but at least you could have had one rate. What did you do? You came up with 8 rates. I can't believe that a revenue secretary actually signed off on the file. How can a revenue secretary sign off on a file with 8 rates? I bet my last shirt Shivaraman would never have done that. How can you have 8 rates for a GST? And then you have a Terrible implementation. I mean, I don't want to get into the details. Many of you are businessmen. Even today, the two forms are not notified. There's a temporary form called 3B. And look at the judicial confusion added to it. The Bombay High Court struck down 3B as not a return. Supreme Court has stayed the judgment, not reversed it. Nobody knows what the GST compliance is. The third one is tax terrorism. It's undoubtedly tax terrorism. Talk to any businessman, he'll tell you the kind of notices they get. Even the junior most officer in the income tax department has the right to issue notices today. How can you do that? At one point of time, 2 years ago, they were threatening to issue 1 lakh notices. The capacity of the income tax department does not extend to processing 1 lakh notices. Then why do you issue 1 lakh notices? Every time a notice is issued, look at the flutter it creates in the board of directors in the company. You have to attend to those things. And then retrospective taxation. Look what's happening to the telecom companies. Let me caution you, you'll end up with a monopoly here. The two will sink. 35,000 crore and some 29,000 crore. Vodafone has already declared its intention. We'll pack up and go.
Regulatory overkill.
Look at what they've done to SEBI. Have you seen the new SEBI regulations? The SEBI regulations made in the last 5 years? Mind-boggling gobbledygook. You can't make out what the regulations say. There's regulatory overkill. See, there must be light touch regulation in many areas. There must be intense regulation in some areas. There must be prohibitive regulation in some areas. But you tar everybody with the same brush and say heavy-handed regulation. How does one do business in a world? How does one do business in a country? You criminalize laws. They're going to criminalize some more laws, I'm told. And today they have said they're going to impose import duties. Read Arvind's paper. Arvind says, don't cut personal income taxes, don't raise import duties. That's common sense when there is a recession. When there is a demand-driven recession, lacking demand recession, you don't cut personal taxes, which are progressive, and you don't raise import taxes, which are regressive, or GST, which is regressive. He says, don't raise it. Specifically says so. I said it in my speech. I said it in my column last Sunday. But they're going to do that. They're going to meet the GST Council, is going to raise the taxes. They are doing exactly the wrong things. The consequences will be disastrous.
And centralization of decision-making in the PMO.
Everybody in government knows there's only one place where decisions are taken. Every secretary has to report to the PMO at about 10:30 in the morning, take his brief for the day, come back and report to his minister at about 11:30. So most ministers don't even come to office before 11. But why? Why come? They only come at 11 because the secretary will come and tell them what the brief for the day is. I mean, ministers tell us privately, MPs tell us privately. Every brief comes from the Prime Minister's office. Cabinet notes are no longer drafted in the ministry. Cabinet notes, draft cabinet notes are drafted by the secretary and his joint secretary in the PMO. And the draft cabinet note, after vetting, comes to the minister. The minister simply signs off. Cabinet meetings themselves are extremely short because the Prime Minister has already approved the cabinet note. So what's there for the minister to say? It's a highly centralized system. Which is why Raghuram pointed out in his lecture, Rajan pointed out in his lecture, an authoritarian centralized system doesn't work. Because ideas, contrary ideas, talent that is spread all over the government simply gets suppressed. Nobody wants to say, why should we? I mean, I'm not going to be listened to. Why say it? Why say it? Which is why most directors and even joint secretary level is no longer IAS officers. because they don't want to go on deputation from the state to the center, because they're completely powerless there. So why go there? So they've got now, I'm not saying anything about those services, they've got Indian Forest Service officers, Indian Ordnance Service officers, all kinds of officers are occupying positions of director and joint secretary in key ministries. People who've never handled general administration.
On the question of recession, I was going to ask you, at what point can we realistically describe an economy as being in recession? You mentioned...
Technically, 2 quarters of negative growth.
In developed economies. Should our definition
That
be
is the
somewhat-
point. This is valid for a stable economy, a stable state economy. It's valid. 2 quarters, Germany, 2 quarters of negative growth, it is recession. But it doesn't apply to a developing economy. In a developing economy, the definition of recession is when growth is so low and it's declining. Look at our growth rates for the last 6 quarters. 8, 7, 6.6, 5.8, 5 and 4.5. 5 quarters of declining growth. Now, technically this is not a recession, but for all practical purposes, this is a recession. This is a recession. And we must therefore be alert and say, this is a recession and therefore let's do something about it. But if you say, there is a proverb in Tamil, Poona kanna mudichana, olagam astamanichana. You think that the world, the sun is set. The sun is not set, it's the cat which is closing its eyes.
You have interacted with the poor and the marginalized. Do you think the government, and also the previous government, did enough to address the problems of mass poverty, multiple deprivations, and massive
Not enough,
unemployment?
and I concede that point. I think we were, to some extent, deluding ourselves by looking at the average level of poverty. When Dr. Manmohan Singh visited me, I told him, sir, Dr. Saab, in future, let's not talk about poverty being reduced to 20%. That's the national average, maybe. But in the Hindi heartland, I think poverty is above 40%. It's abject poverty. So I don't think, it's like saying the average depth of the river is only 5 feet. Since I'm 6 foot tall, I can cross the river. Now if you cross the river, you will drown in the middle of the river, but the depth is 10 feet. So average may be 20%, but the reality is not. In the poorest parts of India, which is still part of our country, we belong to that country and we owe to that people to lift them. I think poverty is as high as 40%.
I won't go into the question of the rural economy. For that, it's best that you and M.S. Swaminathan, Professor M.S. Swaminathan, be in conversation. There's not enough time also. But if you want to make any comment on that quickly.
See, there are 2 things in rural economy which are very, very worrying. One, rural wages have come down. Arvind Subramaniam's last economic survey said for 4 years, rural wages have been stagnant. Real rural wages have been stagnant. Now there is evidence that rural wages have actually come down. Maybe this year the monsoon is good, it may pick up. Rural wages have come down. The second worrying fact is rural consumption has come down by 24%. They're already at a low level of consumption. If that consumption comes down by 24%, is what the NSSO says, these are 2 very worrying things, which is why there's no demand. Arvind points out, and I had data earlier, practically in recent memory, non-durable, fast-moving consumer goods sales have declined. Non-durable, not durable. I can understand refrigerators, air conditioners, but non-durable consumer goods have declined. If rural consumption declines, if rural wages decline, I think rural poverty has deepened in this country.
One other question, the credibility of economic data has come under serious question, whether you're talking about unemployment, declines in rural and urban consumption, or mass or poverty.
Less said about it, the better. If there's an inconvenient truth, you suppress it. Unemployment data was suppressed last year. Sanitation data, where the survey showed 40% do not have access to the toilets, and 40% do not use toilets, is suppressed. Mr. Parameshwaran Iyer comes out with a statement saying, don't believe all that, what I say is correct. Now the Ujjwala has come out. 50% of Ujjwala connections consume 3.8 cylinders a year, which means they're not using the stove. They can't afford to use the stove. 3.8 cylinders. Average family should have 7 cylinders a year, 8 cylinders a year. 3.8. You saw the report today. So every inconvenient truth is brushed aside. Now, I don't have to add anything. Only last week, Dr. Rangarajan, along with another co-author, wrote a long piece, I think, in Indian Express, saying that this is dangerous. This divergence between statistical data put out by the government and other data is very worrying. Raghuram Rajan has flagged that. Our credibility in the world is under question. This is used to be said about Chinese data. Now they are saying this about Indian data. Now if our data is being questioned, who's going to take us seriously?
But did some of this happen during your government in some respects?
I don't know, we suppressed the report. If you remind me, if I have forgotten it, jogged my memory, I don't think we suppressed the report. Methodology, indeed, the base has changed once in 5-6 years. I have no quarrel with that. But here they have changed the methodology. And that methodology still is mysterious.